Around 5 years ago, in early 2020, Apple moved away from Intel x86 architecture to its own ARM-based processor and chipsets. And ever since that, Apple M-series silicon has pretty much been leading the way in power efficiency and performance. And as someone who has been using Apple's last Intel MacBook, one of their flagship i9 products at the time, as well as their flagship first generation M1 Max, I can indeed say that the difference is substantial, but it's indeed most apparent in the efficiency and thermal departments. And it's funny because, as we'll see, efficiency and thermals were one of the reasons why Apple moved to Intel in the first place. But as that architecture plateaued, it became more and more energy inefficient, to the point where this i9 model has been labeled as an expensive space heater. And while I don't fully agree with the accusations that have been made against this generation of notebooks, I still think these are okay machines. I can definitely see what the issue was. But Apple has been moving towards its own architecture for a while. I mean, they already basically had a bunch of custom high efficiency and high performance chips in their iPhones and iPads, so it was just a matter of time before they started implementing that in their notebooks and desktops. I mean, everybody saw it coming. But what's interesting is that around 20 years ago, they made a decision that nobody saw coming. A decision, in my opinion, might have been even more important and had more impact on Apple as a company. So in this video, I'll try explaining why I think Apple moving to Intel was such an unexpected but welcome change. And of course, I'll talk about how it changed their computers, what was it like for an average Mac customer to switch from their latest and greatest PowerPC machines to a new and experimental Intel-based units. The 90s were the times when Apple used to base its whole identity on contrasting itself to so-called Wintel PCs, that is, computers that ran Intel processors, and by that time that was the Pentium lineup, in combination with Windows operating systems. At that time it was Windows 95 or 98. And they were absolutely king of the world as far as popularity and sales go. But for Apple, the mid to late 90s, those were the dire straits. They were near bankruptcy when Steve Jobs took over in 97, and even when things started picking up with the success of their iMacs and iBooks, they still continued to aggressively push their strategy of differentiating themselves from Intel's mainstream systems. And that feeling of rivalry between the giant monopoly and a smaller, at least then, but more innovative company, sort of a David and Goliath story, seemed to be very important to the user base as well. I mean, they loved hating on Intel and Windows. So you can imagine how they felt when part of that rivalry was killed off by introducing Bill Gates on the stage and telling the fans Microsoft will be part of the game from now on. And I mean, Microsoft developers started regularly attending their WWDC events, slowly getting more and more accepted into the Apple community. And in hindsight, it was an extremely important decision, not only from the business standpoint, but consumers benefited greatly from this inclusiveness, not having to deal with this toxic relationship with the biggest software company in the world. But that was all software. From a hardware standpoint, Apple continued to viciously roast Intel's new processors, particularly the Pentium 2 line of products, including the lower-end Celerons, as well as the Pentium 3 and 4 lineup.
Apple Computer would like to apologize for toasting the Pentium 2 processor in public.
They particularly mocked the mobile versions as compared to their PowerBooks and iBooks, mainly because of how power inefficient they were. And there were countless ads about roasting their lack of power, slowness, and the fact that you could, quote, fry an egg on them, and so on. There wasn't a Macworld or an Apple event of any kind to go without Steve and Phil doing a throwdown between a Pentium machine and their latest PowerPC-based machine. And everybody was cracking jokes, pointing and laughing and enjoying the spectacle. But then somewhere around 2005, it all suddenly stopped being funny, and mainly because their new flagship processor, the G5, as powerful as it might have been, it proved to be much less energy efficient than the previous generation G4, which unfortunately meant they were suddenly the ones doing the frying of the eggs. And so during the WWDC 2005, they broke the news to their developers and audience.
And so it's time for a third transition, and yes, it's true. We are going to begin the transition from the PowerPC to Intel processors.
Now, it might not seem like such a big deal today. I mean, over the decade and a half of Macs shipping with Intel processors, people tend to forget what it all meant. So hopefully this little intro gives you some insight on why it was such a big deal and why it seemed like such a large blow to Apple's identity, at least as far as the hardcore Apple fans were concerned. And again, in hindsight, it was a damn good move, and it was something that kinda went against Apple's philosophy in more ways than one, even from today's perspective. In many ways, Apple is about doing their own thing, many times for the worse, and it's not very common for them to conform to a standard, especially one they went against for so long. But chances are you already knew all that. I mean, the fact that Apple switched from PowerPC to Intel is not any sort of news to anybody, but if you're a younger person or just aren't into Apple products, you might not have known why it caused such a big ruckus. Me, I've been using Macs in one form or another since the late 90s. I mean, back then they were my dad's computers, but in the early 2000s I did inherit an iBook I used for school. And I didn't know anything about what sort of an architecture they ran on or whatever, I was just a kid. But I did know that they wouldn't run PC software, which pissed me the hell off because I could hardly run any games on it. So for me, my first experience with an Intel-based Mac was my dad's MacBook Pro from 2006. And yeah, the biggest difference I remember with any sort of clarity is the compatibility and the performance upgrade. But to be honest, I've personally skipped like 2 generations of processors. I went from a G3 iBook to the Intel Core 2 Duo, but I did of course use more advanced computers. We had like a Pentium 3 tower, I believe, in the living room. So I've never actually experienced what it was like going from the latest PowerPC products to the early Intel equivalents, and that's really what I wanted to find out for myself. Like, what if you had, for example, the G5 iMac and you've upgraded to the Core 2 Duo iMac, or if you had a G4 PowerBook and you went from that to the MacBook Pro, would the difference be as drastic? Would it be similar to the difference users experienced with the Apple Silicon transition? Well, the only way to find out is to whip out some machines from my basement shed and take them out for a spin. The first machine on the table is this iMac G5, and although it's not the first iMac with the LCD screen, that would be the G4 model I also did a video on, it did set the precedent as far as the form factor goes for all subsequent iMacs, with the screen suspended on an aluminum foot. I had it for a while. I must have gotten it from an auction, but I honestly don't know. I have a couple of these Snow White iMacs I've collected over the years just because of how cheap they were. Anyway, I wanted to make sure it powers on after sitting in storage, and yes it does. Not only that, but it still has a working installation of Tiger I seem to remember installing on it. I like having Tiger on these higher-end PowerPC machines just because of the classic compatibility, because I do like running OS 9 apps on occasion, and in my view it's the most appropriate OS to run, just given the time frame, and I don't really like pushing newer operating systems on them, even though I do think this particular one can run Leopard. Anyway, there were still some interesting apps and files left over from the previous owner, and I just wanted to share some of them with you. Just beautiful. Now, in a couple of my previous videos, we've been messing with some G4 systems, but it's been a while actually since I had a G5 machine out, so I was curious how different that would feel in comparison to the G4. So I've started to set the machine up, and I was mainly curious about comparing some day-to-day tasks, web browsing, gaming, yes, that used to be a thing you could do on a Mac, emulation, and some video editing, and so on. I will be comparing these things out of the box, which I know isn't ideal. I'm sure some people would prefer if I'd install an SSD in all these machines, or max them out in some other way, or install Linux, or run some specific benchmark, or something. But this video in particular isn't about that. It's about the average user experience, and the overall difference between these architectures. So since I was going to be comparing how software runs on these things, I wanted to load up some software on each machine. And just messing around this thing, doing some basic work, felt decently fast, but as you know, speed is relative, and it all might seem fast enough until you pit it against a more powerful system. So that's what I've proceeded to do. It was time to add this thing's older brother to the equation. And by golly, they look mighty similar. Yeah, during the first couple of years of this transition, Apple didn't change the design almost at all. Apart from rearranging the ports a bit, adding an eyesight camera, although I do have to say that some rare later models of the PPC iMac also had an eyesight camera, and making the thing slightly slimmer, it really doesn't look too different from its G5 counterpart. And even though I could have run these benchmarks separately, I kinda like the idea of having them side by side. It really does paint a better picture overall. As far as the specs go, I took out a stick of RAM from the Intel models, so they both have 1 gig of RAM, and even the processor speed is similar, even though that's not really a metric that's super relevant here. Also, I do have to say that this Intel Mac isn't the earlier Core Duo model, it's the dual cores, so the Core 2 Duo, which are far more common. They were produced for far longer than the single core models, so that's what I'll be pitting this G5 system against. Since we're going to be taking a look at gaming performance, one thing to note is that these machines are very similar as far as the graphics go. They both have ATI Radeon cards with the same amount of VRAM, 128 megs, but the Intel model does use a PCI interface while the older G5 has an AGP slot. Many applications during this transition were distributed as universal binaries, meaning they were compiled for both Intel and PowerPC architecture, so I've tried using as many identical applications as I could. UT 2004 here is a pretty well optimized game, and it runs flawlessly on both systems, and looking at it side by side, it's really hard to notice the difference. So I wanted to have some way of monitoring the performance, but unfortunately there's no easy way of monitoring the FPS, especially on these old PowerPC machines, but I've installed 2 widgets which will hopefully help us get the feeling of how much resources these games hog up. So we have a couple of things in this corner here. One is the CPU temperature and the other is CPU utilization, that is what percentage of the CPU clock time is taken up by the system. And this is exactly in line with everything we said about efficiency and power consumption. The G5 system is running very well. It's chewing through that game about as well as the Intel machine, even though if I had to guess the Intel model is pushing a slightly better frame rate. But the G5, man, the game is hogging up all the system resources, and the temps, holy crap. This thing is steadily reaching 80 degrees Celsius, about 180 Fahrenheit. Yikes. And the application I'm using to monitor the temps suggests that the thermal limit at which this thing starts throttling back is 85 degrees. So we're very near that thermal overload limit. And the Intel machine is chilling at like 40-50 degrees Celsius, around 120 Fahrenheit, and like 50% GPU utilization. So that's what's up with the G5 architecture. It's not that it wasn't powerful enough, it definitely packed a punch as far as the performance goes, it was just burning too much fuel to get there. I've also tried some other games like the demo for Call of Duty 2, and again, the performance was very comparable, and having played this on a G4 system, yeah, this is much better than that. This game unfortunately doesn't run in windowed mode, so I can't tell you much about the temps or the CPU utilization, but safe to say that the Intel machine draws much less power. And I've also noticed a slight but notable improvement as far as frame rate goes on the Intel system. Gotta get a strategy game a shot, so I've set up a demo for Age of Empires here, and again, both machines are doing a good job running this game. However, again, the G5 is getting hotter than a $2 pistol. And one other game I remember struggling with on a G4 machine is of course Doom 3, which, I mean, yeah, when it came out, this game looked and felt like it was made in the same timeline the game takes place. And also, this is one example where I can confidently say that the Intel system does a much better job running. The G5 just struggles with frame rate in game. It's not unplayable by any means as far as I'm concerned, but it does stutter much more, and I'm sure it would get even worse as the gameplay gets more chaotic. And again, it's often going over 80% of CPU utilization, and the temps climb into the 70 and 80 degree mark, whereas the Intel machine hangs around 20 to 30% and stays around 20 degrees Celsius cooler. One more gaming related thing I wanted to try was emulation, specifically N64 emulation, because I know how much that sucked on my G4 systems. So I wanted to compare that to the G5, and wow, yeah, nothing of sorts. The G5 just tears through that emulation with no issue. It does just as good of a job as the Intel machine, locking in at steady 30 FPS for the most part, dipping a couple of frames here and there. Oh yeah, this 64 emulator I'm using has a handy frame counter built in, so we can monitor the actual FPS for a change. Again, the Intel machine stays on average around 20 degrees Celsius cooler than the G5 system. One more CPU intensive task I wanted to try was video editing, and no, I don't really plan on doing any video editing on these machines today. However, I wanted to see how long it would take to import a clip into iMovie and then export it as a DV video file. And yeah, this is 2006 video editing for you. Importing this 47 seconds, 4.5 megabytes, 640 by 480 video clip directly into my timeline took around 15 minutes. So remember that next time you get mad while editing your 4K footage. Interestingly, the G5 took roughly the same amount of time, maybe even less honestly, but since this is such a CPU intensive task, it actually started thermal throttling. Take a look. So it would hit around 83 degrees Celsius, and then it would drop the CPU usage a couple of percent, in turn adding to the estimated time to import the video clip. So that's very interesting. All in all, both machines took a similar amount of time to import the file, and then the export just took a minute or so. No noticeable difference actually, which is fascinating since the Intel iMac does have dual processors and dual cores. And finally, the last thing I was super curious to try was web browsing. And to be honest, I knew the Intel machine was perfectly capable of browsing the web, since I do it all the time on my 17-inch MacBook, but to keep it fair, I use the same browser, which is called Interweb. There's a PPC and Intel version, and it's the most up-to-date PowerPC browser I know of, so I wanted to use the same thing on the Intel machine. But one thing I was curious about was YouTube playback, and I was surprised to see the Intel machine did a fine job playing a video in 480p resolution. I mean, wow. No, seriously, this is a near 20-year-old machine, and it's capable of playing a video I've uploaded like last week. That's very impressive. It also does fine in full screen mode and in 720p playback too. Although at that point it did start to drop frames. However, this was all kinda expected, to be honest. As I've said, I've used plenty of old Intel MacBooks and I know they still do an okay job browsing the web. What I didn't anticipate was for this old PowerPC beast to even load YouTube, let alone freaking play a video. Well, play is a strong word. I mean, it's more of a slideshow. The sound is coming through along with some bits of video here and there. But still, this is miles ahead of what I thought could be pulled off with a G5, and I'm seriously impressed. So that concludes the tests I wanted to do on these Apple desktops from the transition period. And if you were looking at these two machines around 2006 and for some reason the G5 was significantly cheaper than the Intel model, I mean, I totally get why people didn't feel it was necessary to jump sides immediately, even if the machine was slightly slower or it got hot or whatever. I mean, who cares? It's a desktop. You can't even tell it's hot just by using it. Also, it wasn't noticeably louder too. Both machines kinda made the same amount of noise. So just going by the desktops alone, you might not think this Intel switch was as big of a transition for people. But there we come to the other supremely important class of products for Apple, and those are the portables. And that category didn't have a G5 in its lineup. The most powerful portable from Apple, the PowerBook, was using a G4 chip, already a couple of years old at that point. Since the G5 was so inefficient power-wise, it never did end up being used in a portable. And the thing that came as its successor? That's right, it was the MacBook Pro line of portables introduced in 2006. And looking at these two, I mean, you'd be forgiven for thinking these are the same computers. They're pretty much exactly the same as far as dimensions, form factor, everything. They're in the same aluminum enclosure, but the ports are ever so slightly different. On the right hand side, the MacBook Pro actually lost this cool S-video out the PowerBook had. Kinda sad actually, but it made up for it by having a freaking MagSafe port on the left. That's right, this is when the venerable magnetic connector was introduced. Notebooks before that had a standard barrel jack looking plug. So yeah, these laptop and desktop machines underwent pretty much no cosmetic changes in their first couple of years of transition. The iMac was updated in 2007 and the MacBook Pro in 2008. But was the experience different? Was there a more significant change from the PPC to the Intel than the desktop machines? Well, only one way to find out. Now, my PowerBook here is in a bit of a rough shape. I have two of them, both have issues with the screen. One has a broken screen and this one has issues with the backlight, but it's in far better cosmetic shape, even though it looks like someone tried to pry it open in one corner. So we'll be using this one with a special add-on, a cheap piece of shit non-Apple monitor. Yeah. Talking about the specs, my PowerBook actually has more RAM. It's equipped with 2 gigs, which is the maximum amount this model will take, although it is SD RAM and not DDR2, and it also has a lower CPU clock speed than the desktop variants. It runs at 1.25 GHz and it has less VRAM, 64 megs. The MacBook Pro is sporting a 2.2 GHz Intel processor with 2 gigs of RAM and 128 megs of VRAM, so similar to our desktop machine. The first thing I wanted to test was the same suite of games we tried before, the first one being UT 2004, and we can immediately see the G4 can't really get up to speed. The frame rate isn't nearly as consistent as with the G5. I'd still call this barely playable, and after cranking down the quality settings, I got some slightly better results, although nowhere near the performance of the G5. And looking at some statistics, yeah, the game is hogging up all the system resources, however, the computer is not getting nearly as hot as the G5, and yeah, that's all to do with the performance per watt, which was actually higher on the G4. What's also interesting is that the portable Intel machine, while it's performing very good, it's actually getting noticeably hotter than the desktop unit, which makes sense since it doesn't have nearly as good thermal solutions, a smaller heatsink, smaller fans, etc. But this performance discrepancy only grew larger the more software I tried running. I mean, look at Call of Duty 2 here. I actually remember playing this when I was a kid on a 15-inch MacBook Pro, exactly like this one, and yeah, it runs pretty great, but the G4, holy, it's truly unplayable. It runs even worse than when I tried doing so on my other G4 systems, the eMac and the Power Mac. Yeah, this is absolutely unplayable. RIP to the kid who wanted to play this back in the day, but his dad only had a G4. Yikes. Doom 3 wouldn't even start up, which isn't a huge surprise since the system requirements do list a 1.5 GHz or higher G4, and this is only 1.25 GHz. Emulation, more of the same. We get single-digit frame counts, and it makes this a totally unplayable scenario. I mean, look, I'm already getting the first star in the level on an Intel machine, while the G4 is still playing the intro cutscene. Brutal. So I didn't really have high hopes for a good web browsing experience, but I was just curious what it would look like on this poor G4. On Intel, again, I got admirable performance. I've actually downloaded a couple of things, played a YouTube video, again, pretty similar to the experience I had with the iMac. For my PowerBook, I had to get a different version of the interweb browser, since the one I had been using was a G5 exclusive version, but it kept complaining about the expired certificates, so after changing the date and time settings, I've tried loading up YouTube, and I mean, I'm not kidding, this took minutes. It took me around 5 minutes to get to the video on my channel, and then another 5 minutes to get any sort of video to show up. I mean, the sound came on, and every like 10 seconds, I'd get a new frame. Lovely. So, what have we learned here? Well, I for one was very curious about this question for some time now, and after making this video, I can honestly say with first-hand experience, I can totally understand why Apple chose to switch to the emerging Intel Core technology. Even if Intel systems were somewhat comparable performance-wise to the G5, that architecture had already peaked and plateaued, while Intel's new architecture was just getting started. But the jump from G4s to Intel's Core processors, holy crap, that's when it really hits you. And even though Apple was known for their iMac desktops, the laptops were taking up a more significant chunk of their sales figures at that point, and even still today. And while at that point in time it was perfectly normal and acceptable to have less performance in a notebook when compared to the desktop, but by 2005 it was clear there would have to be a successor, and the G5 wouldn't be it. Oh, and not to mention probably the most drastic change the Intel processors brought about. Now, we've seen PowerPC computers booting into Windows with Virtual PC, but this new breed of systems could boot Windows natively, no emulation, and it became a huge factor as to why so many people were more comfortable to switch to the Mac platform. And the arguments against Apple as an exclusive ecosystem suddenly became a moot point, because now with Boot Camp you had a failsafe. I mean, if you really wanted to run a Windows app or environment on your Mac, you could. And so for the next decade and a half, Apple was using Intel on their computers, all while developing their own ARM architecture for their mobile devices, the iPhones and the iPads. And it's funny how the thing that eventually made them switch from PPC to Intel, which is performance per watt and efficiency, was one of the biggest reasons for them to eventually switch to Apple Silicon. But that's a story for another time. I hope you enjoyed learning about the differences between these two architectures, and if you were one of those people who switched from PPC to Intel, let me know your experiences. Which computer did you switch from? Was it a huge improvement or a disappointment for you? What did you like the most about the PowerPC or the Intel machines? I know there are things I just didn't have time to cover in this video, so make sure to tell me about it in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like these retrospectives, I have a couple more of them on my channel. You also might want to consider subscribing. I do repairs, overviews, retrospectives every week here, and if you'd like to support what I do, you can do so on Patreon. You can join for as little as $1 a month, or more if you'd like. You'll get early access to my videos, and also if you'd like to chat with me and other people, you can join our Discord. All the links will be in the video description. Thanks, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.